Welcome to my Gataki perspective on Mirror's Edge. In this video I'll be breaking down and examining EA and DICE's wonderfully unique but ultimately divisive game, as well as discussing its legacy. Naturally this video will be full of spoilers, so if you haven't played it and intend on playing it in the future, then I'd highly recommend that you come back to this video upon completing the game and experiencing it for yourself. However, if you finished the game previously, or if you have no problem with spoilers, then I hope you join me as I prepare to take a leap of faith. In the world of video games, and in life in general, it's always difficult to go against the grain, to be the one to strive towards building a new IP around new concepts and new ideas, to be the one to convince others to follow you down an uncharted path, to be the one to throw caution to the wind and not only think outside the box, but slowly slide a shovel under the box and toss it into a nearby river. It's even more bothersome to take a leap into the unknown, knowing that years upon years of hard work, financial investment and sheer graft might amount to lackluster sales, disappointing reviews and potential ridicule. However, towards the end of the 2000s, something was ostensibly in the water over at Electronic Arts, as they of all companies seemed on a mission to finance unconventional and ambitious new IPs that had all the potential in the world to break new creative ground within the games industry. I refer to this strange period of time as EA's college years, a term between 2008 and 2012, in which EA became increasingly experimental in an attempt to find themselves. And by find themselves, I mean find themselves a plethora of new IPs that can go on to be franchise names to be milked for the foreseeable future. But EA's quest to find themselves a new teat to milk was actually a rather fruitful time for gamers, as it brought upon the creation of some of their most beloved games and franchises. Brutal Legend, Dragon Age, Mass Effect and Dead Space are some notable titles that all came about from EA's newfound willingness to step away from the conventional games of the time. Although no game harbours the spirit of EA's college years more than DICE's Mirror's Edge. But before I get into Mirror's Edge itself, allow me a brief moment to give a bit of background leading up to its creation. For those of you who don't know, DICE, aka Digital Illusions Creative Entertainment, not the catchiest name, is a Swedish video game developer based in Stockholm. They were founded back in May 1992, but they didn't really come to public prominence until 2002 when they released the wildly popular Battlefield 1942. EA would go on to acquire the studio in October 2006, but prior to the purchase, DICE were already making plans internally to show everyone that they were very much still an independent studio. In a 2016 interview with Polygon, Patrick Söderlund, who was the CEO of DICE during the mid-2000s, said that there was a push inside the studio to do something different. At the time that we were still an independent company, we wanted to push for a new IP. What would follow this desire would be a protracted 7-year development process that eventually led to Mirror's Edge as we know it today. The journey began with the majority of DICE's team understandably focusing on developing the Battlefield franchise, while a very small group of 3 to 5 developers started the long process of pitching new ideas for this IP. According to Söderlund, over the course of the first year and a half of this idea workshop, he saw 10 different pitches with varying degrees of functionality. Some were merely concept art, while others were fully playable prototypes. However, none of them provided the creative fire that Söderlund was determined to harness. Söderlund, in the same 2016 interview with Polygon, talked about this frustrating process and stated that nothing really stood out or felt unique enough or different. Whenever you're in a position to create something new, you have to really think about what you're trying to build, who you're building it for, and what you want to achieve. For us, we wanted to do something that was different, that had its own place in the market and felt fresh and unique. At some point in a creative organization, in order for it to continue to thrive, you have to challenge people to do something that they're not comfortable with. Söderlund's seemingly futile search came to an abrupt halt when a team knocked on his door with a pitch that could potentially provide the hammer to break the box of convention, a parkour-based first-person game. Initially, Söderlund held some reservations about the idea, saying that first-person movement in general is difficult. For you to understand where you are in the world, spatial awareness becomes difficult. However, according to Eric Odedal, definitely saying that wrong, an employee at DICE at the time, whenever a white box demo started making the rounds, people at DICE started to become excited at the prospect of this first-person parkour game. Söderlund said that the white box demo was basically only first-person movements in a completely untextured environment, but with fairly decent animations, but when he first played it, he was completely blown away. As basic as the white box demo obviously was, Söderlund said that when he was coming up to a wall in this first demo, he wondered if he could run on it. Without any tutorial or direction, he pulled it off, and it left a huge grin on his face. The employees surrounding the project clearly felt that they had something special on their hands, but Söderlund remained worried that the core concept would simply be too difficult to pull off. He would hold on to these reservations until the team came back to him with a prototype that included refined first-person movement, and the element that finally sold Söderlund on the concept, as well as the same element that ended up being the most memorable aspect of Mirror's Edge: its beautifully bright, hyper-clean art style. Its instantly recognisable look was something that greatly appealed to Söderlund, as he wanted people to immediately know what game it was just by looking at a screenshot, something that it's safe to say was achieved with Mirror's Edge. With its unique visual identity, its unmistakable protagonist established in the form of Faith, and its unique gameplay mechanics all coming into place, Söderlund had found what he was looking for. He had found the creative concept of which he was going to ride the wave of uncertainty with and build a fresh new IP on the back of. The project was greenlit by DICE and Mirror's Edge was born. So with all of that said, how did the game actually turn out? Mirror's Edge can best be described as a first-person action-adventure platformer. It was developed by EA DICE and published by Electronic Arts. The game was originally released for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in November 2008, with a Windows version being released shortly thereafter on January 13, 2009. Mirror's Edge has the rare distinction of being considered a cult game, even though it was released by one of the biggest gaming publishers in the world. Now, when I say it's a cult game, that isn't to say that Mirror's Edge was a commercial disaster or anything.
I don't have the exact sales numbers, but I think it's fair to assess that it sold less than what EA expected. Do you have any comments on the sales of the title?
I guess expectations are always hard to handle, and
it was being, promoted as the big release for EA last fall, and to be honest, it didn't sell that much.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping.
no, it's again, it's a matter of handling expectations, and I would still argue that being a brand new IP, seeing, still the sales numbers backing up all these awards, it's still, I would call it a really successful launch, and it is a really good game. And I think also it's very easy to get carried away when you look at the potential of games, and many of the greatest games ever have come out at a point. It might be the timing, it might be competitors, financial times. There's a million kind of factors playing into what sales numbers you end up with.
It's something for perhaps the marketing people to worry about.
Yeah, I have enough to worry about to decide.
It did manage to sell 2 out of the 3 million that DICE had predicted it would sell within the first 2 years of its release. So while it certainly underperformed in regards to the developers' expectations, I wouldn't quite lump it in the financial black hole category. Its cult status arises from the game's very nature. It was built from the ground up to be something innovative, different, and unlike anything gamers have played before. And therein lied the problem. It was always going to be divisive. Its focus on movement and momentum was never going to appeal to everyone. Oftentimes new concepts just don't catch fire with a large audience, but are in turn lovingly embraced by a small community. I mean, for better or worse, I've never played a game like Mirror's Edge before or since its release. It's truly unlike anything else out there. First-person shooters had dabbled in platforming before, of course, most notably in Half-Life and Metroid Prime, but no one had done it with the grace and fluidity of Mirror's Edge, nor had anyone built their entire game around the concept. Apart from the gameplay, I remember being captivated by the visuals of the game when I played it for the first time. The unabashed use of strong, vivid colours on the primarily white backdrop of a large cityscape was absolutely gorgeous to look at, and the ambient feel of the city had me totally immersed. So much so, I'd routinely go against the game's design by coming to an abrupt stop and standing on the edge of a building just to soak it all in. Moreover, the thrill of parkouring around the city remained engaging throughout the game's 6 to 8 hour story and subsequent time trial and speedrun modes. No other game for me has captured Mirror's Edge's smoothness of movement and sense that I'm actually in the body of the protagonist. Also, the soundtrack deserves a specific mention because, well, just listen.
She nailed it, just right on the spot. 2 hours and we had her entire vocal done. So,
props to Lisa.
Props to Lisa.
The soundtrack is just absolute brilliance. However, for all of its prowess in terms of art direction and ambience, when you peel away the aesthetic beauty and the innovative take on the first-person genre, there are some glaring issues that prevented Mirror's Edge from fully realising its vast potential. Playing through Mirror's Edge can be an exhilarating experience, even 10 years removed from its original release. I feel that DICE did a truly wonderful job in creating that sense of speed and grace that must come with being a freerunner. That's an assumption, of course. I've never partook in freerunning myself, as I would handle it with the grace of a sloth on ice skates. But luckily, Mirror's Edge has my real-life skill set catered to as well, as oftentimes I'd run up to a jump and end up plummeting to my death. The gameplay can be frustrating in that regard, but once you accept the trial and error nature of some of the game's areas and get comfortable with the controls and timing, you're richly rewarded with the feeling of being an unstoppable force of motion. Before Mirror's Edge, first-person titles in general didn't involve a diverse range of motion within the game mechanics, and the player's movement was very restricted in regards to interacting with the world around you. Normally you had a marker of where you needed to go, and the space between you and the marker was routinely packed with a group of bad lads that you had to shoot. Progression was tied in with you shooting those bad lads, so combat was unavoidable. Your feet remained rooted to the ground as you shot enemies or moved around. The pinnacle of world interaction came in the form of crouching or standing behind cover to avoid being shot. The environment often served as little more than a backdrop to the gunfights, not a component of them. You couldn't wall run as you wished, you couldn't vault over blockades freely, you couldn't jump between high-rise buildings in the heat of battle, never mind combining all three in one seamless movement. The only form of somewhat exciting movement came in the form of the rudimentary jump button, which would only really be helpful when dealing with the smallest of barriers or walls. Mirror's Edge doesn't adhere to these restrictions. While it might share the same perspective as the first-person shooters that came before it, mechanically it's an entirely different beast. It's much closer to a platformer game, and not a typical one at that. Unlike conventional platformers, Mirror's Edge removes the player's knowledge of where they are in relation to their environment. Not knowing exactly what's coming up after you leap, combined with the relentless focus on speed and momentum, makes for an absolutely thrilling gameplay experience, and it's one aspect of the game that stands the test of time. Simply put, it's still fun as hell, and gives a nice degree of satisfaction when you land a combination of daring moves. The city serves as one wonderfully crafted obstacle course. Once I got used to the controls, I was once again having periods of uninterrupted running. I'd smash through a door at full speed, leap off a balcony and land with a perfectly timed roll, shoot right back up and vault over a fence, only to slide under a fence on the other side and fall to my death. I mean, honestly, when it comes together like that, it's mesmerizing. The city, while looking like a beautiful open-ended metropolis, is entirely linear. Sure, You've got a few different paths to take, but for the most part you're on rails. I've heard many people complain about this. An example would be players complaining of missing jumps of distances they made earlier in the game simply because it wasn't the path you were supposed to take. Another example would be the fact DICE tease players with a fast, intriguing city to explore, only for players to never be afforded the opportunity to do so. I can definitely understand perspectives such as these, but I would argue that the lack of diversity in the locations of the game is down to narrative issues, but I'll get to that later. I personally like its linear gameplay structure, the reason being that it's a surefire way to make sure the kinetic motion, which is Mirror's Edge's greatest strength, is always at the fore. In saying that, there are a few minor problems that interrupt that feeling of kinetic motion. Vent crawling, pipe crawling, hiding from ledges and climbing ladders feel like a roadblock that don't mesh particularly well with the pulsating pace of the parkour mechanics. Although I can understand that they're there to add diversity to the objects Faith is climbing on or over, as well as a bit of a respite from the constant speed, but they're a bit of an annoyance to traverse. The breathtaking skyline can be a little confusing to navigate at times, but unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty setting, the game provides you with something called runner vision. Runner vision is essentially a GPS that takes the form of a beautiful blob of crimson red that guides you on where you should go or where you should jump next. It's a handy system and it helps keep the momentum going. Furthermore, if you need even more help, you're able to press a button that prompts Faith to turn towards the direction she must make her way towards. All in all, when I was outdoors, I wasn't stuck for too long on where I should take the next daring leap towards progression. Combat in Mirror's Edge is not exactly encouraged, but Faith can utilise a few moves to take on the faceless goons of the city. When unarmed, combat is handled with very basic hand-to-hand moves, wall kicks, slide kicks, and my personal favourite, a leaping drop kick to the balls. These moves are generally quite weak, but are fine in a one-on-one scenario, but against a group of enemies, engaging unarmed is a surefire way to die, as you need to land multiple hits to take down an opponent. In order to even the odds, Faith must get her hands on a gun. This can be achieved by disarming an enemy by pressing a button prompt at the right time when the enemy's gun turns crimson red. If you get your timing right, Faith then takes the gun in a gloriously stylish takedown. After, you can then unload on any poor bastards in the area. Although if you mistime the gun disarmament, you leave yourself open to being brutally murdered at point blank range in seconds. Quick side note, the image of Faith firing off a submachine gun just doesn't fit her character in my opinion. It just feels at odds with the tone of the game. In fact, anytime Mirror's Edge strays from what makes it unique, it coincides with a massive drop in quality. Nowhere is this more evident than in the gunplay. In short, the shooting mechanics are woeful, something that is rather shocking considering DICE's history with first-person shooters. And the thing is, it's not so noticeable in the sections of the game that gives you the option of avoiding combat. Normally I could run or parkour my ass right past enemies, and since Faith's hand-to-hand combat is so basic, you could argue that DICE are probably trying to discourage me from fighting by making the mechanics to do so largely ineffective. But as the game moves towards its conclusion, it takes the odd decision of highlighting its biggest flaws by forcing players into small rooms packed with well-armed and well-armoured groups of enemies. In these encounters, you're brought to a grinding halt and restricted to poorly designed, claustrophobic rooms that are seemingly created to frustrate. You can't avoid them, and every mechanic that's built to excite and create momentum on the rooftops and streets fail you. You lose the clear paths and sense of free flow that makes Mirror's Edge so damn good. Even the B button or circle on PlayStation that is used to guide you on where you should go breaks down when Faith is indoors. All it does is guide you aimlessly towards a wall or the ceiling. This is incredibly annoying when you're in a confined area with bullets flying around you. After all, it's quite a challenge to spot the little red object and where you should go next when your ass is getting shot at. During these shooting sections, the game essentially devolves into the most generic, bland, shitty shooter you could ever hope to play. Again, it's so bizarre that the gunplay is so poorly implemented considering DICE's history with first-person shooters. It's so clunky and at odds with the rest of the game that it's as if DICE just didn't care about it or forgot that they ever made a Battlefield game. It's simply mind-boggling to me that these sections were greenlit. If anything, they stick out even more in the years since its release. The only thing I can think of is that the gunplay was included on the back of pressure from the higher ups over at EA. I mean, looking back on the marketing leading up to the game's release probably backs this feeling up, as the early trailers predominantly featured clips of gun-heavy gameplay. It's definitely not an accurate indication of what the game would actually entail. It appears that EA were certainly willing to take risks on new IPs and ideas, but only up to a certain point. Even though EA were in the midst of their college years, they still wanted to have a job to go to once they graduated. By the simple inclusion of some poorly implemented shootout sections, the game could easily be disguised and advertised as a more traditional first-person shooter game, therefore leaving the door open to more sales and a wider potential audience than that of an out-of-the-box parkour game. All the while, DICE can focus their energy on fine-tuning the elements of the game that inspired them so much in the first place, and ignore the shooty bits they obviously didn't give a fuck about. The most annoying aspect of this suspected intervention from EA is that the trailers were primarily promoting the absolutely worst aspects of the final game. Mirror's Edge was built on the foundation of providing gamers with a truly innovative, fresh experience, so it's unfortunate that more conventional gameplay elements that didn't fit that foundation were tacked on. You can't break new ground on an old foundation. The worst aspects of Mirror's Edge were seen as the most marketable, but their inclusion hindered all of the other wonderful and unique mechanics present in the game. Unfortunately, Mirror's Edge's problems don't end there.
Once the city used to pulse with energy, dirty and dangerous, but alive and wonderful. Now, it's something else. The changes came slowly at first. Most didn't realize, or didn't care, and accepted them. They chose a comfortable life. Some didn't. And those who refused to conform were pushed to the sidelines, criminalized. They became our clients. We call ourselves runners. We exist on the edge, between the gloss and the reality, the mirror's edge.
Firstly, I feel like I always have to say this when I'm talking about Mirror's Edge's story. The premise is fucking fantastic and full of potential. Mirror's Edge takes place in a dystopian future where an Orwellian-style government has full control over the media and is monitoring every form of electronic and digital communication. What naturally follows is an unnamed city packed with residents enjoying a luxurious, comfortable lifestyle, woefully oblivious to the digital prison that has slowly enveloped them. Due to the increasing lack of digital privacy, people must find an alternative way to exchange sensitive information. This is where the runners come into play. Runners basically serve as hired badasses who effortlessly traverse the cityscape and skyways to physically deliver packages on behalf of their clients. Runners are the only way to counteract the prying eyes of the government in the city, so the clients must entrust them with such sensitive information, otherwise that information cannot make it to who they want to get it to. As you begin Mirror's Edge, you step into the well-worn shoes of 24-year-old Faith Connors, voiced by Jules Dijon, who is one such runner. So yeah, that's a hell of a solid premise in my ever so humble opinion, but what's so damn frustrating about Mirror's Edge is that it does absolutely nothing with it, at all. This frustration is amplified when you watch the story trailers that were shown before the game's release, as they hint that the story was supposed to be a lot deeper and fleshed out than the narrative that eventually made its way into the final game. I mean, there are so many fucking questions right out the gate that never get answered. Who are Faith's clients? How is free speech inhibited? Where are the destroyed parts of the city and what are they like? Why are the government evil precisely? How many of the citizens actually support the government? Who are the members of this supposed underground and how do they plan to retake the city from such a powerful government? Are the runners the real criminals? After all, they are transporting sensitive illegal documents or potentially drugs, I don't know. Are those my feet?
Hey, what's that thing there? Are those my feet?
I guess what I'm trying to say is that upon replaying Mirror's Edge for this Kataki perspective, I was met with the same feeling I had all the way back in 2008. The story just feels cut together and incomplete. However, after a bit of digging, there may be a simple explanation for this. Mirror's Edge's writer Rhianna Pratchett, who has also worked on Tomb Raider's 2013 reboot, The Rise of the Tomb Raider, Heavenly Sword and the entire Overlord series, was apparently brought in as a lead writer by DICE quite late in the development process. DICE had developed the game with no narrative in mind, so this meant that Pratchett's story had to fit the game's levels that were already there, as opposed to being developed alongside them. Pratchett discussed her experience with writing Mirror's Edge in detail during a fascinating interview with the National Science and Media Museum.
That led on to Mirror's Edge, and as I said, they'd been looking for a writer for a long time. They designed the whole game with no narrative in mind.
Really? They got that far? So
yes. So they kind of they hadn't answered any of the questions about why the city looked like this, why Faith moved through it the way she does, and who she was as a person. I think they had the name Faith. That was it. They didn't have anything else. So they'd come up with the aesthetics. They'd come up with the mechanics for it, and they also had all the levels that they kind of wanted to do. So on boats or up the buildings and sewers and things like that. So that was all established, and so then I had to go in and go, okay, this is like this because of that, and they move through the world because of this, and I think I actually came up with a name, Mirror's Edge, which everyone thought was weird at the time, but we'd kind of gone through every possible momentum title we could, and they'd all been taken by racing games. And so I just came up with, I thought, oh, this is kind of a weird one. It's a shiny city, on the edge of it, and kind of now everyone sort of accepts it, but I remember at the time everyone's a bit sort of dubious about it. But it sort of, it fits the game because it was very kind of unusual aesthetic. It was kind of low on violence, but kind of strong on momentum and a sense of freedom. And I think that sort of made it very unique at the time. But yeah, when I came aboard, they'd gone a long way with the design and the mechanics, but they hadn't really thought about why the world existed in the way it did.
So they definitely had a female lead character.
Yeah, I mean they'd gone so far as I think originally they wanted to do a kind of cops and robbers style multiplayer game. That was one of the early prototypes, and they'd just done a kind of bucket load of concept art for loads of different characters, and they just sort of identified Faith as, oh yeah, she looks cool, maybe we'll have her, and then that was it. But they didn't think about her as a character or why she looks the way she looks, or why she parkours. So there's a sort of, there was a kind of lot to be done in a relatively short space of time, but so we're kind of limited on time and budget, and there were a lot of obviously constraints in place, but sometimes constraints can actually make you more creative. Yeah. So I think what we were able to do within the constraints that were there were kind of sort of work with the game. Obviously, I don't think we necessarily got them across as well as we could, and given more time and budget, I wish we'd been able to do more in-game engine stuff and not the kind of animated scenes. And also a lot of script got cut at the 11th hour when they decided that Faith wasn't going to speak during levels. Right. But everything had been written and recorded by that point, so they just sort of chopped everything out, and that we lost a lot of world and character deepening, and just sort of little, not major plot stuff, but just colouring the world a lot more was lost, and that was very disappointing.
Pratchett would discuss where she was planning to take the story and any potential sequels in another interview with Game Happens on the 3rd of March 2018.
Directly to Mirror's Edge, because there the story is very different, right? Although I've read that when you got to the project, most of the gameplay for that game was already done. So how did that one go?
I mean, this is the kind of peculiarity of games development, really. Everything was done with no narrative in mind, so the world looked like the way it did because they thought it was a cool aesthetic. They didn't think about why it looked like that, which is where you start as a writer, but you don't necessarily have to start that way as an artist. all the gameplay had been designed, but no one had really thought, like, why is she moving through the world like this? Why does the world look like that? Why is she dressed like this? How does all the why questions? And so I had to go in and retrofit the story back through what was there, which is, it's very backwards way of working compared to any other entertainment medium where you're always script-led. But I've never found one where they just designed everything and no one had thought about why. And so I had to, I think what we managed to sort of get in there was, helped hold up the world. But it would have been much better if, I'd been there early on and I could have helped build that with them instead of having to, just sort of be a narrative paramedic, really.
Well, I don't know if you're very lucky or just extremely talented, but this is something that surprised me a lot when I read about it, that the game was there before the story, because it fits so well and also ends up being a very original story, because compared to many other games where the bad guys are really evil and bad, when I was playing through Mirror's Edge, I got this very interesting idea that these rebels are fighting against a government that isn't explicitly evil aside from how they control communication. So it's more like on principle basis that they are fighting against this thing. So how did you end with that concept instead of like doing Half-Life where they just like kill everybody, they're evil government people?
It was kind of just the idea that potentially a government could get citizens to give up their certain rights and freedoms for a kind of more comfortable life, a more safe life. I think it's Irvine in California that's a city that's pretty much run by a company. And it was just kind of extrapolating by those ideas and thinking, okay, what if it was just like a nanny state taken to extremes, but kind of in a city, and like it's actually a pretty nice and a safe place for the citizens, and it's just the extreme nanny state. It's very high surveillance, but what you see of the shining city is actually only one part of it. In the comics, comics tend to be where I put everything that I can't fit in the game. So I wrote the original prequel story to Mirror's Edge in the comics, which I did with DC. It was a 6-parter, and it was all about how Faith became a runner and her relationship with Kate and her family, and how that
for the record is different with what EA decided to
yeah,
go with their
it's
sequel
very
prequel.
I haven't played Catalyst and I wasn't involved with it
right.
at all, so I don't know how different it is, but I think they took some influences from the comics, I believe. But that's kind of where I did it first, because originally the team were talking about doing a sequel to Mirror's Edge, like straight after the original one. That never happened, obviously.
I wish it did.
Well, I mean, in the comics, I could do a lot more of what I would have done in the game if I'd been in earlier, or encouraged the team to do, and that was kind of explore who their clients were, what they were transporting, and the ramifications of that. And because of where I came in with the game, and because of the gameplay that was there, you have to work with what you have, and that's how games writing works. You get this box of narrative body parts pushed across the table to you when you start, and you don't know what it's going to be.
It upsets me that Pratchett's full vision for Mirror's Edge's narrative was not realised, as it sounds infinitely better than what we were given. Mirror's Edge's story is kind of like if George R.R. Martin set up the entire mythology and world of Game of Thrones, and then decided to focus on Hot Pie's love of baking for the rest of the series. You can't really help but get the feeling that there are way more interesting things happening elsewhere. Amazing locations and intriguing themes are set up, but you're blue-balled for any sort of payoff from those, and instead giving a bland murder mystery to solve. And the thing is, the murder mystery plot could have been enthralling if done well, but you're given no context or character motivations at all. The murder mystery begins when Faith heads to the office of politician Robert Pope after the first delivery of the game goes slightly awry. Faith goes there because her sister Kate, who happens to be a blue or police officer working for the oppressive government, was investigating a break-in at Pope's office and she may be in trouble. Kate arrived at the office to find Pope dead and now she's been framed for his murder. But why should I care? I've only just been introduced to Faith and given no real background on who she is and what her motivations are. Her sister just showed up as well, and now a supposed great guy in Pope is dead before I even got the chance to know anything about the dude. What were his policies that could have brought about such a great change to the city? Are democratic elections still a thing in a totalitarian state? Was he even really a good guy? Anyway, Kate decides not to flee the scene as it might make her look like even more of a dodgy bastard in the eyes of the police. She's then subsequently arrested. The story then meanders through the theme of corruption until its end, as pretty much everyone around Faith turns out to be a double agent. Jackknife, a former runner who Faith seeks information from in the wake of Kate's arrest, may as well have a big sticker on his head saying, "Bad lad." The only other runner Faith has any sort of meaningful interactions with during the game, Celeste, also turns out to be colluding with the big bad Project Icarus. This is my primary problem with Mirror's Edge's narrative. It just throws you into a situation or rushed conversation without providing you the context and why you should care about what's happening. Faith is a cool character, but she isn't fleshed out to any sort of meaningful extent. The shock of finding out all her runner friends betray her falls flat because we don't know enough about these characters to care. Moreover, the story is also predominantly told through stylish animated cutscenes, but for me they seem disembodied from the actual game. They're gorgeous to look at and well made, don't get me wrong, but I personally would have preferred more of the story to be told in-game, or for some cutscenes to play out through Faith's eyes. Lead writer Pratchett also stated during her interview with Game Happens that a lot of the in-game dialogue for Faith was omitted from the final game, and that the plan was to include more in-game interactions between characters, but ultimately most of what was written and recorded was cut. Again, that's just a damn shame. The story was clearly an afterthought, and I wish DICE focused more on implementing a strong, cohesive narrative that built on its strong premise. A great narrative could have enhanced the whole experience, but the one we got ultimately dragged it down.
On the edge all your life, Faith. Sooner or later, you have to jump.
It might seem like I detest Mirror's Edge, given the fact I've been complaining about its gameplay and story for the majority of this video. But what's so odd about this game is that it has long lingered in my mind years after playing it for the first time. The thing is, I still love Mirror's Edge, flaws and all. There is a soul and beauty to this game that arrests my attention every single time I play it. Its tranquil simplicity coupled with its ambient music, unique core gameplay mechanics and stunning use of colour often comes agonizingly close to gaming bliss before falling just short on account of its shite shooting mechanics, weak storytelling and poorly designed indoor set pieces. Earlier in this video, I quoted Patrick Söderlund from DICE. Whenever you're in a position to create something new, you have to really think about what you're trying to build, who you're building it for and what you want to achieve. For us, we wanted to do something that was different, that had its own place in the market and felt fresh and unique. Without a shadow of a doubt, Söderlund achieved what he set out to in regards to Mirror's Edge having its own place in the market and feeling fresh and unique. 10 years after it made its bow, Mirror's Edge demands to be remembered. But I would have to say that Söderlund didn't follow his own advice about thinking about what you're building and who you're building it for. Mirror's Edge was built on the concept of a first-person parkour platforming mechanic, but a strong gameplay hook and wondrous art design can't completely compensate for weak or completely fragmented storytelling. Creating a strong female lead with an instantly iconic look bucked the trend back in 2008, but it means nothing when her character is 2D and underdeveloped. Lastly, having the faith to build a new IP on the back of a unique mechanic is tremendous and absolutely admirable, but the publisher or developer feeling the need to shoehorn in more traditional mechanics like shooting for no other reason than to just have it, even if it's detrimental to the overall experience, is a surefire sign that they weren't quite sure who they were building the game for. Mirror's Edge was supposed to be the first entry in a planned trilogy, but the sequels in their originally intended sense never happened. It would eventually receive a sequel of sorts with Mirror's Edge Catalyst 8 years after the original's release, but hey, maybe that's a story for another day. I would argue that Mirror's Edge's greatest legacy would be the influence it had on the games industry going forward. The game was released in a time when narrative-heavy, stylish, not-so-shooty games weren't particularly in fashion. In the years after Mirror's Edge's release, a slew of such games would make their home on the indie game scene. Many followed Mirror's Edge's example by incorporating minimalistic looks and ambient soundtracks. In the time since its release, I both love and appreciate Mirror's Edge more than ever, and hate it more than ever. I love and appreciate it more and more because to this day it still has a personality and identity that is truly its own. I hate it more and more because all the ingredients were there waiting to craft what could have been my favourite game of all time, but DICE just didn't get the recipe right. However, in daring to be different, Mirror's Edge managed to achieve what so very few games do, and that's leave an indelible mark on me and many other gamers in spite of its shortcomings. The flaws that I personally noticed, while glaring in places, just aren't enough to break the unwavering personality of the game. And that's why I'd strongly recommend it to anyone who might have missed Mirror's Edge the first time around. You might love it and you might hate it, but you'll definitely remember it. Thanks for watching.